Was always surrounded by people who'd been impacted by neurological conditions as an adult when I secured my first job in the not-for-profit world. But that's the thing about neurological conditions. They are so common and you just never know. You know, with epilepsy, you never know when you could be diagnosed. Anyone at any time can be diagnosed with epilepsy.
Epilepsy and neurological conditions broadly, what's the broad spectrum looks like? Which ones are permanent and which one are short-term?
We don't talk enough about neurological conditions. For epilepsy, 1 in 25 of us will be diagnosed. How we can reduce death and injury rates due to epilepsy. So death and injury rates are sadly way too high.
What's the overlap between the term disability and epilepsy and vice versa?
Epilepsy is a standard alone condition, is not considered a disability. But there's so many people out there with epilepsy, and how often, Dev, do you hear people talk about epilepsy?
Not that much.
Isn't that terrible?
Yeah. It's 1 in 25 people will have or will get diagnosed with epilepsy. When that hits you, what are the initial signs? Welcome, Emma. How are you?
Thank you, very well.
Thank you for sharing your time and coming here today. Could you talk about a bit more about your background and then what you've been doing with Epilepsy WA?
Certainly. So I have been working in the charity world for over 20 years, showing my age. I believe in a fair go for people with epilepsy, and epilepsy is a condition that is stigmatised and misunderstood. And Epilepsy WA are trying to change that. So I'm very proud to be the CEO of Epilepsy WA and have been for 8 years now.
Could you share your backdrop from what were you doing in the last 20 years of work experience?
Yes. Well, when I first started work, I actually worked in the electrical world at a distributor for extension leads, and I was actually doing really well. We were selling extension leads to the equivalent of Bunnings, so really big contracts. And this was in the UK, and I just found it really dissatisfying. I wanted to put my energy and time into something that does good, as corny as that sounds. So I started working in the not-for-profit world, and I've worked in the not-for-profit world ever since. I have a particular passion for neurological conditions and lived experience of neurological conditions, and I used to work at Epilepsy Queensland. So when I secured what was my dream job at Epilepsy WA as their CEO, it felt very natural. It's a condition that had touched my family, and it's a condition that needs to come out of the shadows and people need to speak about.
Could you, before we go into the side of epilepsy, but could you share growing up, how has your purpose evolved, and then could you share what's your purpose?
So I'm the youngest of 6 girls. From a very young age, I was always surrounded by people who'd been impacted by neurological conditions. So, for example, my sister Bern, who actually went on to get her master's degree, she was hit by a car on a bicycle, and she acquired a brain injury when I was just a baby. And through my childhood, various people came into our lives who had acquired brain injuries. So I naturally, I think, developed an empathy and an understanding of how difficult it is for people who are struggling with neurological challenges. Then, as an adult, when I secured my first job in the not-for-profit world, and got that feeling of, when you're getting up in the morning, not just to earn a wage, but actually to hopefully improve and save lives. There's no more rewarding feeling than that. And it can be quite disheartening sometimes working in the not-for-profit world, and it can be really sad as well, especially when you're impacted on almost a daily basis by people enduring terrible trauma. I'm fortunate to do what I do. And ironically, when I started at Epilepsy WA, I actually was diagnosed with a neurological condition myself and I required brain surgery. But that's the thing about neurological conditions. They are so common and you just never know. You know, with epilepsy, you never know when you could be diagnosed. Anyone at any time can be diagnosed with epilepsy.
And if you mind sharing in terms of epilepsy and neurological conditions broadly, for the audience to understand what the broad spectrum looks like on the neurological conditions, and of which ones are permanent and which are short term. If you can just elaborate on the idea.
So with neurological conditions, there is so many neurological conditions out there. And we don't talk enough about neurological conditions and indeed brain health. For epilepsy, 1 in 25 of us will be diagnosed. Anyone at any time can be diagnosed. Some forms of epilepsy, such as certain types of childhood epilepsy, may actually self-resolve as a child matures, grows up. But obviously they have to be treated and risks need to be reduced during their childhood. But that's not always the case. For some children, unfortunately, no, they don't grow out of their epilepsy. A lot of adults with epilepsy the reality is they will be on medications for the rest of their life, and at any time they may start having seizures again and may need to have their medications adjusted or go on different medications. And then there's always 30% of people living with epilepsy that no matter what medications they're on, no matter what treatments they have, they actually still have seizures. So even today, with all the breakthroughs in medicine and in research, 30% of people with epilepsy won't gain seizure control.
Wow. Could you contextualise in terms of numbers, how many West Australians will have or are diagnosed with epilepsy, and Australians, and a bit more understanding on what kind of support systems are supporting Australians with epilepsy?
1 in 25 of us will be diagnosed, but at the moment, at this very point in time, 1% of the population has epilepsy. So in WA, that's over 28,000 West Australians currently live with epilepsy. But 1 in 25 of us will be diagnosed in our lifetime. So that means that over about 130,000 current West Australians will at some point be diagnosed or have already been diagnosed.
Okay.
So the figures are staggering, aren't they?
They are.
Really are.
And then could you, and what kind of supports and services are wrapped around people who are diagnosed with epilepsy?
I'm proud of the services that Epilepsy WA provides. We've been going for over 60 years and we provide a large network of support groups. That peer-to-peer support is so important to connect with others who know what it's like to walk a similar path to you. We have a telephone information line. We loan out seizure alert devices. We have the largest display of seizure alert devices in the country. And seizure alert devices, we know, are one part of the jigsaw puzzle in how we can reduce death and injury rates due to epilepsy. So death and injury rates are sadly way too high. And if we look at seizure alert devices as one part of an overall risk reduction plan, we literally can save lives. So Epilepsy WA is promoting the use of seizure alert devices, educating the community about seizure alert devices, providing community connection, providing information and valuable support whilst people are waiting on wait lists for medical treatments or testing. When people are feeling isolated and alone, Epilepsy WA is here for them. And we try and impart lived experience insights into everything we do, and I'm really proud of that. I'm proud to work at Epilepsy WA. They're a wonderful organisation.
Wow. From a point of view of what's the overlap between the term disability and epilepsy and vice versa, and does epilepsy is considered a disability or other way around?
1 in 4 people with intellectual disability will also have epilepsy. Epilepsy is a standard alone condition, is not considered a disability. However, if you speak to many people with epilepsy, they would beg to differ and say that their life is impacted in numerous ways on a day-to-day basis. People can be having tens of seizures a week. Other people, they may be seizure-free, but it doesn't mean the epilepsy is not impacting them. They have medication side effects. They are subject to stigma and discrimination, and that's stigma and discrimination is really alive and well in WA, I'm afraid to say, and we need to stamp out that stigma. And in terms of NDIS, it can be very difficult for people with epilepsy to actually get onto the NDIS because it's not classed as a disability. And how can a condition which we know that 1 in 2 people with epilepsy will have depression, we know that for people living with epilepsy, they experience a seizure-related injury at a rate of 1 in 10 per year. How can this complex condition not be considered a disability? And because it's not considered a disability, people find it very hard to get support from the NDIS. Some people do manage to, but it's often the comorbid conditions that are helping them to get that NDIS funding. But when they're so profoundly impacted, and a lot of people say actually it's the epilepsy that impacts them the most. And I have a niece, Sarah, who had a childhood stroke when she was 12 and she's now 22. And although she's partially paralysed and still lives with a range of impacts due to that paediatric stroke, she says the hardest thing in her life is her epilepsy. But that epilepsy is not a disability. I disagree. It is for many people.
And how is the advocacy with the NDIS to be listing epilepsy as a known form of disability, which most of the people who have experienced, that's what they're calling it. How is that advocacy efforts going?
And it really does depend on how well controlled your epilepsy is and how that epilepsy is impacting your day-to-day life. Now, the thing about epilepsy is everyone's story is very different and everyone's road they walk is very different. Epilepsy WA and all the state-based epilepsy associations are constantly lobbying government, trying to ensure a fair go for people with epilepsy. We take part in focus groups, we submit feedback. We're always hopeful that there will be changes, but it's a hard slog. And it's certainly a hard slog here in WA, but we need to be brave, we need to speak out.
And in terms of, because if it's, as you said, most of your services are peer-to-peer and every journey is different and people need to know that somebody who has traversed that path before, how does peer-to-peer work in experiences where the experiences are fairly varied, or how does that peer-to-peer services support people?
Our network of support groups is really well attended, and we actually have them professionally facilitated by nurses. Now, and we recruit people with lived experience themselves of epilepsy or other neurological conditions. Due to the level of self-harm and depression in our community and trauma, not just for the person with epilepsy, but also for parents, for example. So a parent of a child with epilepsy, research says that they'll experience PTSD at a rate as high as 25%. So we have a professional facilitator at each of our groups, and we've been running these groups for decades now, and we're finding that they are so beneficial. We're hearing from our community that they are so beneficial. I'm literally having members of our community tell me that they wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for those support groups. Now, the nurses that facilitate our support groups, they also actually go out to schools, to disability agencies and also to aged care to teach about epilepsy and its impacts, to help break down stigma, and also to teach in the administration of emergency medication, which is sometimes a very important part of that seizure first aid for people who have particularly tonic-clonic seizures.
Can you talk more on the idea, the concept of depression and how it is impacting people and families with epilepsy?
So they say 50% of people living with epilepsy will experience depression. The reason for that is complicated. It's very complex, but what we do know is navigating life with a chronic condition is not easy. We know that epilepsy can impact people's memory, their cognition, it can put barriers up in their life for their employment, barriers in driving. They're subjected to discrimination. So these are all things that we as a community can do something about. Let's break that stigma. Let's bring epilepsy out of the shadows. And perhaps we can then help reduce the terrible impact that epilepsy does have on a lot of West Australians.
And do you mind sharing, if you can, you said you have a lived experience, and how has that journey of your own informed you differently?
So my lived experience is I had a period where I was getting lots of pins and needles and tingling in my arms and hands, and I went to the doctor, thought nothing of it, will just pass. I then was driving with my 3-year-old daughter on the highway, and I suddenly felt like my head had exploded. I find it a little hard to talk about. I felt like I had a bat hit me on the back of the head. And I was on the Mitchell Freeway, and Hannah was 3. I don't know how I managed to pull over, called 000. It ended up that I had an Arnold Chiari malformation of my brain. So I have a big brain, literally. I tell my husband that all the time. And my brain was hanging into my almost spinal column, and then my cerebral fluid wasn't getting around my brain.
Oh, okay.
So I was having what are called thunderclap headaches, and a headache so horrific that all I could do when they happened is, I need help. It's not the kind of headache you could even breathe through. You're just in such intense pain that comes on like that. I was in hospital for several weeks before they actually worked out what was going on with me. And then I was transferred to another hospital, and I had my dura patch, so that's the lining of my brain. I've got a synthetic patch. I've had a strip of skull removed from the back of my head, and I've had part of my top vertebrae removed as well to make space for my very big brain.
The extreme. Wow. Oh.
But
God.
I think it's given me an understanding of how challenging it can be for people. Empathy for people. I always had empathy, but perhaps more empathy, more understanding of how difficult it is to navigate the health system. Understanding of how your life can just change in a split second.
Yeah. And are there any ongoing effects of it, or is there how do you know that, as in, it won't happen again?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate that aside from me being a little bit nervous of balls at a park, so if I go through a park and there's a ball flying in the air, I sort of do that. But now that I've had my dura patched and my skull kind of opened up, I guess, to make way for that big brain, I hopefully will not experience any impacts into the future. Obviously, there is a slight chance of a leak of the synthetic patch, that kind of thing over time. But I choose to try not to think about that because it's a little scary. But I did get great care in the end, and I just know that those insights for me and my family, and it was such a hard time. We had no family around us in WA. Hannah was 3 and my wonderful husband was so supportive. To go through something like that and then to be so fortunate to come out the other end, it makes you appreciate everything you've got, but it also just gives you empathy for others that are navigating a very complex health system who are in scary situations. Health can be so challenging when people are experiencing ill health and conditions like epilepsy, which is so unpredictable. People need and deserve so much support from the community. We call people with epilepsy warriors at Epilepsy WA, and that really is the case. I'm humbled and by epilepsy warriors and their stories every day. You know, brave people who keep going on day after day.
And when you say somebody is not aware that they might, get through, 1 in 25 people will have or will get diagnosed with epilepsy. When that hits you, what are the initial signs so that those, you said you had tingly sensations?
So mine wasn't an epilepsy diagnosis. Mine was an Arnold-Chiari malformation of the brain. Epilepsy is where someone has more than one seizure, unprovoked seizure. So people with epilepsy will experience seizures. Seizures are not just the kind of seizures you see on TV, where someone drops to the ground and shakes.
Yeah.
That's a tonic-clonic seizure, but there's actually over 40 different seizure types. So some seizures may look like someone's intoxicated, may even resemble someone daydreaming. So sometimes it takes quite a while before someone is actually diagnosed with epilepsy. But once someone has experienced seizures and then they have testing, then they will be diagnosed with epilepsy and be treated for epilepsy. Generally, that's with anti-seizure medications, which in 70% of the time, people who are on anti-seizure medications for their epilepsy, and I say medications because sometimes people need to be on a multitude of medications, but they will be seizure-free. But that doesn't mean they're not impacted by their epilepsy. But 70% of people with epilepsy, once they find the right medication or mix of medications, of anti-seizure medications, will be seizure-free. But that doesn't mean that they're not impacted by their epilepsy. It's we talk a lot now, and I'm glad we do, about invisible illnesses, invisible conditions, invisible disability, and epilepsy is certainly one of those. And we do need to talk about epilepsy. Every household will be touched by epilepsy.
Wow. How does as you also use the word complex health system, and most of the health funding is state-based. And how somebody navigates the pathway and if they are diagnosed with epilepsy?
Epilepsy WA is here to help people navigate the system. It is complex.
But if somebody doesn't know about Epilepsy WA, but
Yes.
And then what happens with them? What's the typical journey looks like?
Okay. So we make sure that we get our leaflets into GP practices across Western Australia. So if you see a GP practice without our leaflets, please let me know in the waiting room.
Yeah.
Now, the usual journey would be that the person would have a seizure, a first seizure. They probably would be transported to emergency department by ambulance. Or perhaps they actually go to their GP, but usually it would be an ambulance would be called, because an ambulance should be called if it's their first seizure, and also if they don't have a epilepsy management plan. So they would be taken to the hospital, and then the hospital would then refer them on to probably a first seizure clinic, or their GP might refer them on to a private neurologist, or they would be referred on to a neurologist within or an epilepsy centre within the state health system. The wait lists are lengthy, both for private and public, but particularly for public, and the wait list for testing even is lengthy. There's a lot of people experiencing seizures in WA, and during those times when people are sitting on wait lists or they've experienced that first seizure, their world has suddenly been turned upside down. They need someone to talk to, and that's what Epilepsy WA is for.
So once you have the first seizure, you went to the doctor, and then you had the first understand that you might have epilepsy, and then you are on a wait list to go to the further medical treatment. And if in that waiting period another one happens again, and if that is a bit more challenging, who's responsible?
Now the thing is,
in that scenario,
with seizures, any of us can have a seizure. We all have a seizure threshold. So, for example, if you were unwell and your temperature got really high, you would have a seizure, but that wouldn't mean you have epilepsy. So epilepsy is 2 or more, generally speaking. Always the first point of call for someone in the situation where they're sitting on a wait list and their seizures are uncontrolled, and if things get really difficult, is back to emergency care. However, there's a lot of people out there in WA who are having daily seizures. So one of the things Epilepsy WA provides is epilepsy management plans. Now, an epilepsy management plan is a document that your loved ones, your friends, your work colleagues can refer to, so they know how you should be treated in the event of a seizure. Now, 1 in 10 of us will have a seizure in our life, so we should all know seizure first aid. And we all need to know that there's more than just the tonic-clonic seizures that are portrayed on the TV so often. So part of what Epilepsy WA does is actually raises awareness in the community of the importance of understanding and knowing correct seizure first aid. We get phone calls through to the office where people have had a seizure and someone goes and gets defibrillator or is talking about an EpiPen. And it's really important that the WA community knows about seizures, speaks about seizures, and knows how to appropriately respond when they see someone having a seizure.
In terms of the information campaigns or media campaigns, are there any running ones if you want to talk about on the information?
We're always campaigning for awareness. I'm always trying to do media. We are always wanting to spread the word because we know that speaking openly will save lives and reduce injuries. The main awareness months are March, so we've just had a really big awareness month, and we had community service announcements playing on 10 radio stations across the state. We had 57 landmarks illuminate purple across the state for epilepsy awareness. And then there's October where we actually have Seizure Safety Month. We're the only state in Australia that actually has a month-long campaign dedicated to reducing death and injury rates for people living with epilepsy. It's all about risk reduction. And we had our first ever in October, and it was a fantastic success. It was very supported by other not-for-profits. The media were interested. We really got the word out loud and proud, and I'm so glad we did. And, you know, we owe it to the families who've lost loved ones to epilepsy to be vocal, to be creative, to create these kind of brave campaigns. And we need to speak about death and injury rates. And Epilepsy WA is actually up for an Injury Matters Award. We're one of the finalists for an Injury Matters Award for that campaign. So that was Seizure Safety Month for Epilepsy WA. And then March is Purple Month for Epilepsy WA.
Oh, okay. That's good. In terms of, do you think the kind of knowledge and information, or what you got talked about, seizure first aid, do you think that can be embedded in some kind of an education and training programs? And if that, and how young or age appropriate way that information or knowledge or education could be added?
Yes, so Epilepsy WA actually has our own training programs teaching about epilepsy and its impacts, and they do incorporate a lived experience focus. We're trying to get every school in Western Australia to train all their staff. Let's help children living with epilepsy reach their full potential. In addition, we've got a children's book library, and I think it's the only epilepsy children's book library in the whole of Australia. That's supported by Telethon, and we loan out children's books about epilepsy to West Australians free of charge for their children, because whether you're a child that's living with epilepsy or perhaps a sibling's been diagnosed or a parent, it can be really scary for kids. So these storybooks, which are available free of charge, and we post them out right across the state, and we also have online storytime sessions as well.
Lovely.
Just help break down that fear for children, especially when they've been diagnosed, they're having to have testing, they're having to take medications. Well, it's really scary for them at that time. And we have a mascot called Sunny Bunny, and we try and get Sunny Bunny involved in lots of things as well. The kids love Sunny Bunny. And Sunny Bunny is our mascot because any bunny can be diagnosed with epilepsy. And that's the thing, anybody at any time can be diagnosed with epilepsy. People often say, well, I don't have epilepsy in the family. No, no one has epilepsy. But the thing about epilepsy is Anyone can be diagnosed at any time. My brother-in-law was diagnosed out of the blue, who was a very fit marathon runner, and just diagnosed with epilepsy out of the blue. It can happen to anyone at any time, and there's numerous reasons for it. But for most people, you don't even know why you've been diagnosed. So for most people with epilepsy, you don't know why you've been diagnosed. There's no known cause. And then for other people, it could be that it's genetic in nature. It could be, like my niece Sarah, you've experienced a brain injury, so she had her stroke. But there's so many people out there with epilepsy, and how often, Dev, do you hear people talk about epilepsy?
Not that much.
And knowing that it contributes to 1,100 deaths in Australia each year, we've got to talk about it. We've got to talk about it.
3 a day.
You've got good maths.
3 a day.
Yeah.
Wow.
And isn't that terrible?
Yeah.
Isn't that terrible?
Yeah.
There is something, actually at the weekend I'm running 18 kilometres as part of the Buitendag 100, and I'm wearing a T-shirt with Chelsea, who was a 22-year-old girl from Bunbury who died due to sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. 15-year-old Evie is also on my T-shirt, and then Daniel Macon is also on my T-shirt. And I'm running with friends. I'm doing the 18 kilometres. I've got a friend cycling 80 kilometres and another friend swimming 2 kilometres as Team Epilepsy WA for SUDEP awareness. So SUDEP is sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. And that's where someone with epilepsy passes away suddenly. There's no cause for their death. No discoverable cause, and it's a condition called SUDEP, which is actually more common than SIDS. We all know about SIDS, but people don't know about SUDEP, and there's things people can do to reduce their risk of SUDEP. So it's important, although the conversations are difficult ones to have with people who have been diagnosed with epilepsy, it's important that we talk about sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy. And me taking part in the Buitendag 100 this weekend and being vocal about SUDEP and about epilepsy deaths and injuries, it's because I passionately want to reduce deaths and injury rates. And I get to know families really well who've lost loved ones, and we owe it to them. We owe it to them to speak, even if it's hard to speak. We don't want to scare people, no. We want to empower them with the knowledge to reduce their risk. And that's what it's all about.
Wow. Things have evolved in the last decade or so. What do you see are the biggest things to be done in the coming years so that we reduce that number of 1,100 as low as possible? What are the things to be done, top 3 things to be done at a state level and a federal level?
At a state level, I believe in the work of Epilepsy WA, so that the community please get behind Epilepsy WA. State government please stand with Epilepsy WA. Federally, of course, yes, funding is important. We need to provide these vital services. We need to speak openly about death and injury rates. In WA, we do need more neurologists. Let's attract more neurologists to the WA health system. Let's put more funding into epilepsy. We owe it to the 28,000 epilepsy warriors currently living in WA. And it's money well spent to reduce those death and injury rates and ensure a fair go for people with epilepsy.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for sharing the stories.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.